There was an explosion in the mid 2000s of craft brewing. And it really wasn't, it's a lot about what's happening in food now is not new. It is a continuation of a story that kind of went sleepy for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And, Florida had a great history of craft brewing and brewing in general, but there was a huge underground craft home brewing group.
Mm-hmm.
And in the mid 2000s, when conditions were right, you saw a lot of those groups sort of starting and making their own breweries, and especially Cigar City Beer.
Mm-hmm.
And they helped foster other breweries, and people learned at Cigar City and then made their own. And you had what was essentially a brew belt that happened between Sarasota all the way up I-4 to Jacksonville.
A brew belt.
I would call it a brew belt. It's like all these little breweries started proliferating, as was already happening in places like Oregon and California and up in the Northeast. But that really started to take hold in Tampa sort of the late 2000s. And you had all these breweries. I live out in Valrico, and we have 3 or 4 breweries just out there. And that only happened because there was this healthy kind of learn and go do kind of atmosphere at all the other breweries. People would kind of get trained and then say, well, I'd like to make a brewery here. And so they're all over the area. It's kind of plateaued a little bit, but it's still very, very popular. And people are making some great award-winning craft breweries, including at one of the restaurants that I represent, which is Eulalie. They basically make brews only for the restaurant, and it's not circulated. They're not canned or bottled. It is meant to be paired with the food on the menu there, and that's something that happened right around 2014.
Is it worth doing that? Because there's quite a lot of infrastructure that goes into brewing, right? Like I've sat in restaurants and I've seen, they have the big windows. You can see the tanks behind there. You can see the brewer kind of wandering around, tinkering with things. But that's a lot of stuff for a beer that's just in house.
It's an investment. And when Eulalie did it, they bought American-made equipment. That was a part of it. But it's also a continuation of the story of the company for the 1905 family restaurants, because the Florida Brewing Company, a Florida brewery, started in Ybor City using water that was generated partly at that water plant, and that water supplied all of Ybor City. And the Columbia restaurant, the mothership of the company, used that water, and the Columbia started out as Saloon Columbia, which was a tasting room for the Florida brewery. So it's all very cyclical. It's important if you care about telling stories through food, and you can't tell the story of Tampa's food without including brewing in it.
Yeah. Now you've got a couple of selections here.
I brought some friends with me. Yeah. There's a company in Miami called Cerveceria that has the license to make La Tropical beer, which is the brand that Florida Brewery made in the early 1900s. They licensed it from Cuba. It was the #1 beer of Cuba. And then the Florida Brewery in Ybor City in the early 1900s did such a great job. It wound up being the predominant popular brewery for Cuba.
Wow.
There was a shipping line that left from the Deepwater Port of Tampa that went to Havana, a lot of things north and south, cattle, you name it. Miami was still sort of Fort Dallas at that point. But we had the natural port, and we had Henry Plant's railroad that would empty here. So beer went south and products came north. But the La Tropical brand relaunched in Tampa in 2022. It had been in Miami for a while, but that brand hadn't been in Tampa, close to 50 years, and they brought it back in a variety of styles. I brought you some Travelers just for you to sample after the show.
I'm just going to... There we go. Sorry.
We've already had an accident.
I'm just going to hold this up for the camera. I'm not going to crack this, but this is it's a Nativo Key Suave IPA. It's got some looks like flamingos and guitars and stuff going on there.
Very popular on labels. Yeah, it's a nice bright orange on the label. On the outside of the can.
A kind of a... This is, I guess, a little more European-looking can.
Yeah,
so quite.
It almost looks like an energy drink.
It does a bit, yeah.
Well, and depending on your energy level, I guess that works. But the whole point is, La Tropical and the Florida Brewery made ales. They made Bock. They made all different kinds of styles. But it's nice to have. It's almost like time travel. You sip that beer, it's the same recipes that they were using more than a century ago.
You mentioned Cigar City a moment ago. Now, that's a label that's now on lots of supermarket shelves and restaurants, right? But it was kind of a micro brew from the get go.
Oh,
right?
very
And then
much
sort of
so.
expanded.
It was a passion project of a man named Joey Redner, and who worked with a brewer named Wayne Wombles. Wayne is sort of the Rain Man of Florida beer. He just he sees things that nobody else sees. They built up this brewery. You know, the first time they won a medal at the World Brewing Championships, they weren't even in cans. They weren't even in. They were still underway. And I went to do a story when I was at the Tampa Tribune, and they gave me the beer. And they're like, "You want to try some?" I'm like, "Yeah," because I had never tasted it. And I tried it, and they brought out a glass that said Mons Venus on it. I'm not making this up.
Okay, hang on a minute. So this is a reference to
There's an establishment on Dale Mabry that anybody
Right.
who's lived here for a while has driven past. And Joey's father, Joe Redner, Mons Venus, was an original investor in Cigar City, and then had his investment paid back. But it basically provided the seed money. It's a very Tampa story.
Is that the one with the UFO on the roof, or is that a different one?
No, I believe it's the classy one next to the former pizza restaurant, or so I've heard. But anyway, the whole point is that it's a very Tampa story where you take a little bit of seed money and make something that over exceeds anybody's expectations. But Joey knew from the home brewing atmosphere here that beer was ready to kind of grow into the new thing. The most important thing to me for Cigar City was it's sort of like the Habit Tampa cigars that were popular for generations in Tampa that were produced here. Every beer that left Tampa under the Cigar City brand told a different Tampa story, whether it's High Life, whether it's Cracker, whether it's all different kinds of styles that they had. Everything was exporting a Tampa story, and that hadn't happened in a long time. A lot of stuff came in from other places and kind of found a home here, but this really kind of sent a calling card out in a very big way.
Let's come back to the Florida Brewing Company. So it opened in 1897. The building is still there, right? It's like the tallest building in Ybor City.
It is. It's 71 feet. It was 1897 that it opened officially. They had a big barbecue. I think it was something like, it took $200,000 for the investors to open it, which would be like $6 million today. They had a massive barbecue, like 20 different barbecue carcasses there. They had pickles. They had all kinds of stuff. And they said that it was a beer that was so pure that came from something that was called a government spring. They built the brewery right over this spring, and they said that the water was so pure that you couldn't get drunk. That proved not to be true. There was an argument during the event in which somebody reached for a jar and another person reached for a jar. There was a fight, and then there was imminent death. So they got off to a flying start, but it was they had to deal with the temperature, so they had to have an ice plant, and they would brew in the top floor, and then it would sort of cascade and down through the building. Eventually, they would put it in barrels on the bottom floor, and then that's where they would refrigerate everything.
So the building's still there, but there's no beer being brewed there right now.
No, it's a law office now, so it's a much different purpose. It was modeled on a brewery that was first built in Johannesburg, and it opened to massive acclaim in terms of the architecture, the beer that was being made. It was Florida's first brewery, and that lasted up through really about the 1930s. It had a huge impact on not only Florida, but also, like I said, the Caribbean and Cuba.
Now, IPA, India Pale Ale, that was sort of developed as a way to transport beer to India, right? It had like the hops would kind of give it some extra preservative.
The hoppiness is what gives it its signature, and that was a British sort of invention. When they had, I forgot to mention that when they had their opening barbecue in 1897 at Florida Brewery, they had 2 giant alligators that they killed and put on their backs, and then they had platters in each of the front paws of the alligators. I'm not making this up. I read this. The 2 platters, and on one platter was all the malt, and on another platter were the hops. And I thought, that is a display.
Very Florida story.
Yeah, that's not a Martha Stewart kind of display that you would have, but it was very Tampa, and I don't think it was probably very hard at that point. There were only 15,000 people in 1900. 1890 there were 5,000 people, and then by 1900 there was triple that amount, close to 15,000 people who lived in Tampa. That's a lot of production for that small amount of audience, but they really wanted to come out with a bang.
In the last kind of minute or so we have here, Jeff, if you want to kind of do a tour of local brews around the Tampa area, can you still kind of taste some of that history that you've been talking about?
You know, it's funny because there's like whiskey will like to brag that this is Prohibition style. Well, they didn't do that until after Prohibition, you know, and Prohibition took a big chunk out of the Florida brewery in that they could only do sodas and other things for a period of time, even though they got caught doing it. During Prohibition, Tampa was one of the wettest places in America because there was so much coastline, so much contraband. You know, I think that there are styles. The La Tropical beer that's produced in Miami, I think is a good way to taste that style. As far as the current breweries, they're all doing sort of modern versions of beer. But beer is beer. They've been making it for thousands of years. Not to say that that's not a differentiator. Everybody has to have their own little thing. Sure. I'm going out on Wednesday. We're picking wild guava down in Mayaca so we can make a guava-flavored beer at Eulalie.
Okay, well, we'll have to bring you back to sample some of that maybe down the track.
That would be good.
Jeff Houck, Vice President of Marketing for the Columbia Restaurant Group and former food writer for the Tampa Tribune, talking about beer in Tampa. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.